Chapter 76. The Creature. The crowd of animals watched as the creature slowly emerged from the waves. It was tall, with long arms and legs. It had gently glowing eyes. It was a robot. The robot looked very similar to Roz, but was it just another one of those cleanup robots? Nobody knew what to think, so they simply waited and watched. Water streamed off the robot's body as it climbed onto the rocks. Then it gave a friendly wave and said in the language of the animals, "Hello, everyone. It is good to be home." With those words, the crowd knew that their beloved Roz was back. The animals cheered and laughed and grunted and squawked and roared. They rushed forward and surrounded their old friend. There were big smiles and happy tears and lots of hugs. Bright Bill landed on his mother's shoulder and said, "We were starting to think we'd never see you again, Ma." "Forgive me for taking so long," said Roz. "I promised to explain everything. But first, there are 5 goslings I am very eager to meet." Chapter 77. The Grandmother. Roz gazed upon their grand goslings for the very first time. Her eyes glowed brightly. She sat on the rocks and said in a sweet voice, "Tell me, goslings, what are your names?" One by one, they answered, "Cloud Feather, White Stride, Quickwit, Moontail, Light Eyes." "What splendid names you have," said Roz. "It's okay if you mix us up," said Cloud Feather. "Yeah, everybody does it," said White Stride. "A nice thing about having a robotic grandmother," said Roz, "is that I will never ever mix you up." The gosling smiled. "I'm very different from you," said Roz. "I hope you are not frightened by my appearance." "We're not frightened," said Quickwit. "Our parents told us all about you," said Moontail. "We knew you'd be funny looking," said Light Eyes. The goslings giggled. The robot giggled too. Then the goslings waddled over and started inspecting their robotic grandmother. They checked out her big feet and her long legs and her rounded torso, and they pointed out each dent and scratch on her mechanical body. Quickwit flapped into the air to get a better view of Roz's face, and soon all the goslings were fluttering around her. When they settled, there were 2 goslings perched on each of the robot's shoulders, and one was perched right on top of her head. Reader, I don't believe any grandmother has ever been happier than our robot was in that moment. Chapter 78. The Speech. After spending a little time with her grand goslings, Roz was ready to address the crowd. She stood on the ledge and faced the animals. Nearby, a wave crashed, spraying mist high into the air, and a rainbow briefly appeared above the gathering. Roz waited for the rainbow to fade, and then she started to speak. The robot's voice boomed across the shore as she described her northern adventure. She wowed her audience with tales of amazing creatures and places. She recalled each detail that you already know about, reader, but that she eventually got to details you do not yet know about, and this is what she said. "There I was, on a deep underwater mountain, gripped in Crusher's claw, and then we saw the Juggernaut. The mining station was sinking toward us, and it was guided by an army of giant creatures. The ancient shark had found a way to destroy the mining robot, and by the time she realized I was in his grip, it was too late. I do not blame her for risking my life. She was doing what needed to be done. The station sank faster and closer, and at the very last instant, Crusher let me go. I started swimming away, but I did not make it far before the Juggernaut crashed against the mountain. I heard a terrible blast of noise. Metal groaned and screeched as the whole massive station broke apart. Hulking pieces of wreckage were falling all around. I saw a building toppling toward me. Quickly, I scanned the area for any kind of escape, and I spotted a small cave in the rock. Just as I was diving in, the building slammed to the ground behind me, burying me inside. I waited in that cave as the station continued crashing. It seemed like it would go on forever. Gradually, though, the mountain stopped shaking, the noise died down, and I knew the crash was over. It took me a week to climb out from the rubble. I crawled up through the mess, squeezing through crumpled structures and pushing through piles of smashed equipment. Finally, I heaved aside one last piece of debris, and I was free. Before me was a scene of total destruction. Buildings and platforms and walkways and machines were twisted together in a heap that sprawled across the mountain. One of Crusher's claw was sticking up from the rubble. The rest of his body had been flattened. The ancient shark's plan had worked, and the poison tide had come to an end at last. I never saw the ancient shark again, although I did search for her. As I stood there, I let out a burst of clicks and listened for an echo shaped like a shark. What I heard instead was the faint sound of motors, and soon lights were shining down. I hid beneath a mangled machine as a crew of cleanup robots descended. The robots began scooping the rubble into enormous bins. I was afraid of being discovered, so I stayed hidden, and I was scooped up along with the rubble. Everything was hauled to the surface and dumped into robotic barges, and then the fleet of cleanup robots sailed away. Only days earlier, those waters had been filled with the poison tide. It had rushes between island and slowed in the open ocean. It had spread through calm seas until the next current whisked it in a new direction. Flowing swiftly here and drifting gently there, the poison tide meandered farther and farther to the south. The fleet of cleanup robots traveled that same path, removing the toxic dust as they went. Progress was slow, but what they left behind was a clean ocean, ready for life to return. For days and days, I stayed hidden in the back of that barge. Then, yesterday, I carefully peered ahead and saw our island in the distance. I was almost home. I waited until none of the robots were looking, and then I dove into the waves. Once the fleet had passed our island, I swam to shore, where I found all of you. The humans promised to clean the ocean, and they are following through. They also promised this would never happen again, and I believe them. My friends, I am happy to say that the poison tide is gone for good, and we have survived. Life will never go back to exactly how it was, but in time we will move on from this tragedy. Old friends will come home. Fields and forests will regrow. The ocean will thrive again. Our island is already beginning to heal, and so are we. Chapter 79. The Strange Family. Autumn was at its peak, and the island was turning deep shades of yellow and orange and red. Leaves dropped from their branches and floated to the ground. Some leaves landed on the pond and became snacks for the beavers who were busily preparing for winter. Brightbill glided through the crisp morning air and splashed down in the pond. The water rippled beside him, and Rose's head poked up. Then the two of them went for a swim. It was a lovely start to the day, but something was on Brightbill's mind. "I'm sorry, Ma," said the goose. "You've just met your grand goslings, and tomorrow I have to take them away." "Please do not apologize," said the robot. "I know you must fly south for winter. I will miss you all very much, but I am excited for the goslings to go on their first migration." They are excited too. They kept me up late last night with questions about the journey. Brightbill opened his mouth and yawned. "It's a good thing I've got Glimmer. I don't know how you raised me by yourself." "I was not by myself," said Roz. "The geese offered parenting advice. The beaver showed me how to build a home. The deer gave me gardening lessons. Each of our friends helped us in their own way." Brightbill thought for a moment and said, "Now that I'm a parent, I see how lucky I was to have you as my mother. You taught me things I couldn't have learned from anyone else. I wouldn't be me without you. Thank you, Ma." "Oh, Brightbill," said Roz, "your sweet words will make me cry if only I had tear ducts." A smile spread across Brightbill's face, and he broke into laughter. And then came giggles as the goslings flew over, with Glimmer close behind. Roz spent that day with her family, exploring the island and answering questions from the curious goslings. When they passed under an oak tree, Ross explained that old trees could support a broad swath of forest. Underground, their roots entwined with the roots of their neighbors, she said. Through that connection, they share water and nutrients and even information. The forest is a diverse community of living things which is linked together by old trees, like this oak. Grandma, you have a lot in common with that oak tree, said Quickwit. Yeah, you're always helping others and bringing everyone together, said Moontail. Maybe this tree is a grandma too, said White Stride. Ross patted the tree trunk and said, Grandmother trees, I like the sound of that. Then the robot began climbing the tree. Leaves gently shook as she climbed higher and higher. She found a sturdy branch and sat with her legs dangling. There was a flurry of wing bits, and the geese fluttered up to join her. Before long, Ross and Brightbill and Gleamer and the goslings were all perched near each other in that oak tree. We're a strange family, said Light Eyes. Yeah, but I like it that way, said Cloud Feather. The whole strange family nodded in agreement. Chapter 80. The Future. Our story ends at dawn. The eastern sky was growing brighter, and the last few stars were fading fast. Around the island, animals were heading for the great meadow. After months without a dawn truce, they had resumed their old tradition. Bears and frogs and owls and beavers and turtles and hares and moose and the groundhogs and squirrels and woodpeckers and otters and foxes and mice and badgers and snakes and deers and weasels and vultures and many other creatures were going to meet up with their friends. But on this particular day, they were mostly going to say goodbye. You see, the geese were about to leave on their winter migration. The meadow buzzed with excitement as families of geese crowded together. While the adults discussed the travel plan, the youngsters discussed how to properly fly as a group. By sunrise, the flock was ready, but their leader had one last thing to do. Brightbill gathered Gleamer and the goslings, and they all waddled over to Ross. The family members hugged each other tight and wished each other well. Then the geese waddled back to the flock. It was time to fly. Brightbill took a deep breath and honked loudly, and suddenly all the geese were flapping. A cloud of feathers floated down as the flock rose into the sky. At first, they flew in a disorganized jumble, but each goose slowly drifted into place until the flock was flying in perfect V formation, with Brightbill at the point. On the ground, everyone watched and waved as the flock turned to the south, and then Ross started walking, and then trotting, and then running. Following the flock, she raced across the meadow and into the forest. She ducked under branches and hopped over shrubs, catching glimpses of the flock through the treetops. She burst out from the forest and ran as far as she could go to the very edge of the island, where a small cliff dropped down to the rocky coast. Our robot stood there as the flock grew smaller and smaller and vanished into the distance. In the weeks to come, the geese would fly above oceans and mountains and farms and cities. There was a big, beautiful, complicated world beyond the horizon. When the time was right, when the island had recovered, the wild robot would venture out again.